We'll have more information on how you can participate in that virtual event at the end of today's talk. So today's discussion is entitled Immigration and Immigration Rights, What We've Learned in 2020. The United States has a long and complicated history with immigration. And ever since the Republic was founded 250 years ago by a bunch of energetic immigrants, we've been both dependent on the energy and cultural diversity brought by immigrants to help our economy and to define our culture and the ways we think of ourselves, and also the long discussions of who are good immigrants, who are bad immigrants, what can immigrants expect when they come here, why would they want to come here. Today, we're going to talk about current landscape in Milwaukee and across the country as far as immigration and immigration rights goes. We're really fortunate to be joined by two prominent Milwaukee public intellectuals with a lot of experience and understanding of immigration issues as it plays out here in Milwaukee and across the country and across the globe. Dr. Chia Vang is professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She's Associate Vice Chancellor in the Division of Global Inclusion and Engagement. Her research focuses on the Cold War in Asia, Asian American history, Hmong history, refugee migration, and transnational and diasporic communities. She's published widely on these topics. Her first biography, The Story of a Hmong Prisoner of War, is forthcoming. Dr. Vang's work places the lived experience of immigrants and refugees in the larger global economic and political context that shape our world. Of Southeast Asian refugee lives and that of their descendants across 4 continents helps us better understand the lasting impact of one of the most controversial wars of the last century. And she is joined today by attorney Cain, Oulahan, an expert in immigration law. He's a partner at the Milwaukee firm of Murar, Oulahan, Rivas, and Hochstetter, recent past president of the Wisconsin Hispanic Lawyers Association and incoming chair of the Wisconsin chapter of American Immigration Lawyers Association. He serves as legal advisor to the Wisconsin State Board of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, and is consultant attorney to the Mexican Consulate in Milwaukee. Attorney Oulahan focuses on family-based immigration, deportation defense, naturalization, post-conviction relief, and the immigration consequences of criminal convictions. He's a frequent contributor on immigration law to radio and television programming across the city, and is fluent in Spanish. I'd like to welcome both of you today. And we're going to start out by asking if you could, starting with you, Dr. Vang, if you could talk a little bit about how you came to do the work that you do, and how does your personal history reflect and direct and influence your work around immigration and refugees. And you're muted.
We will continue to be doing that all the time. So thank you so much. Nathan, no, just Chia Vang is just fine too. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. These are issues that I care very much about, both personally and professionally. And so this conversation, I think it's what we should be doing, and we will continue to do. That's a really good question. I am a scholar of 20th century US history. I really look at immigration, but in particular transnational migration. And I pay really particular attention to forced migration. That's the bulk of my research. I look at mostly refugees from Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos who came to the United States, in particular after the Vietnam War, is what we call it in the West, right? In the Western Hemisphere, but in Asia, everybody calls it the American War. So I'm very interested in policies and what key actors or nation states do, but I'm also very interested in how refugees interpret their lived experiences. So I really believe that we all bring, as an educator and researcher, I believe that we bring who we are to the work that we do and how we make meaning for ourselves as well as people in our, in our spaces. So I can't say enough how my own personal experience as a refugee influences or continues to inform the work that I do. Like the 1.4 million refugees from that region, my family came to the United States in 1980. So very, very long story short, we tried to leave the country in 1975 as well, but because of the, tension at the time, we couldn't. So we stayed in Laos until 1979. Long story short, the elders finally found a way to escape the country. We arrived in Thailand in October of 1979 and applied for resettlement in the United States. We arrived in Minnesota, next door, in April of 1980. And that's where I grew up. I was about 9 years old at the time, had no formal education before then. And so my family, we really, like many refugees, we relied on refugee cash assistance and publicly funded healthcare programs for some time. But then within, a decade and a half, all 6 of the children have graduated from college, 2 of us with doctorate degrees. And so it is really, our position as refugees who are stateless, who are really powerless, who are completely dependent on the kind of the mercy of host countries to allow us to resettle, right? To allow us to find refuge. But at the same time, it is really that powerlessness position to be categorized as a legal refugee that enabled us to resettle in a third country. So I'm interested in these larger policies and practices, but I'm also interested in the decisions that refugees make, right? They don't have to leave. They can stay and face whatever consequences. But people like my parents and thousands of others in the past and today choose to leave with the hope of finding a better life for themselves and their children and their family. So that's kind of where I stand. I've worked with mostly Southeast Asian refugees from those 3 countries in my research, but within the last decade, I have worked with refugees from Somalia, refugees from Eritrea, and here in the Milwaukee area, I've also begun to work. I did some research, published a couple of publications on refugees from Burma and Bhutanese. Have done some small projects with the Rohingya population. So the lens is through displacement, through forced migration. That's my research. And then also my community work is really informed by, again, my personal experience as a refugee.
Excellent, thank you. Cain, can you answer that question? How did you come to do the work that you're doing now? And how does your personal background?
Absolutely. Thanks so much again for inviting me. And what an amazing story Dr. Vang has. Thanks for sharing that. And mine is really quite different. I mean, I don't have any direct recent experience with immigration, being an immigrant or a refugee. I grew up in Milwaukee, in the inner city. I went through Milwaukee public schools, my entire K through 12 education. I grew up with my dad running a nonprofit on the south side called Esperanza Unida. So I was, from an early age, exposed to diversity all the time, saw the value in it. It really sort of, that childhood influenced me in what I sought out later in life. When I went to college, I was studying Spanish and decided to study abroad in Nicaragua, and had just an amazing experience living in a country that had some of the worst poverty in the Western Hemisphere, but people with such generous spirits, and really just had an amazing transformative experience there, became fluent in Spanish. And when I came back, I wanted to do some type of work where I could be working with the Latino community, using the Spanish that I had learned to help people in some way. And I wasn't finding a good fit for a while. And I landed at a small immigration law firm as a legal assistant, which just sounded interesting to me. They needed someone bilingual. And I started working with an attorney on immigration cases, family-based cases, some asylum, defending people who were being deported. And I really just fell in love with the work. And I saw it as a way to, connect with people, but also just to have such a huge impact, direct impact in their lives, a way to keep families together. It just was so critical and just really rewarding for me. And so I decided after a couple of years as a legal assistant that I wanted to go to law school, that this was something I really wanted to pursue as a career. So I worked my way through law school at Marquette while staying at the immigration firm the whole time. And I really never looked back. I've been working with immigrants from all different countries. Certainly, I've had clients who are Hmong and from other Southeast Asian countries, but really from all over the world. And a large majority of my clients are from Latin America, and in particular Mexico. But I do have a huge variety, and we have a really amazing variety of immigrants in the state of Wisconsin. Some folks are aware of that, others may not be, that we have immigrants living all over the state and from many, many different countries. So I would say my background in seeing a diverse community and the value in that, and then getting some skills along the way in speaking Spanish and actually seeing people struggling in a country like Nicaragua inspired me to do this kind of work where I could really seek justice through the legal system that we have in place.
That's excellent. It's both of you are engaged in such. I mean, it's a diverse approach to issues that have a lot in common, and it's really exciting to me to learn about the sort of work that's being done toward equity and justice around these issues. The theme of our talk today is immigration and what we've learned in 2020, and I'd like each of you to take a minute to talk about when you started this work decade ago, in your case, Cain, and maybe a little more than that, Chia, in your case. What were the chief issues facing immigrants and the people with whom you worked? And maybe we can start with Chia on this one.
Sure. Thank you, Cain. Also, I really love your experience as well, because I have done research across the globe, and one of my research sites is in South America, in French Guiana, in Argentina. And so I thinking about my family's own experience in the US, and then trying to understand the refugees who went to other countries, their experience is so dramatically different, but yet people survive in similar ways. So I thank you for sharing your experience as well. That's a really good question, because sometimes when I think about how long have I been doing this work, and it's like almost like my whole life really thinking about it, right? When I think about refugee experience and immigration, but then professionally in my work, I finished my first graduate studies in 1996. And as you all remember, that was the passage of the federal welfare reform law that dramatically changed, so many things for immigrants, in particular, even illegal immigrants, right? The assumptions and debates around that policy was that, all these immigrants were, taking over all these resources, and so we need to deny them access. But in fact, a lot of the legal immigrants who are impacted, actually, the target was illegal immigrant, right? But people, though, that population, undocumented immigrants were not accessing these federal programs. They couldn't, right? So a lot of illegal immigrants were impacted by that. So I started working for a organization called Urban Coalition in the Twin Cities, where I was a policy analyst doing community-based and education and advocacy work, where we produce policy papers and then use them for education at the legislature, both in Minnesota and at the federal level. So I did a lot of advocacy work. And I remember some of the things at the time were, especially around welfare reform, was that, again, many people were cut off of their food assistance program, right? These illegal elderly immigrants were being cut off. And one of the other things that I remember very clearly in that time was that many refugees or former refugees, right, who were youth and who had committed crimes were then facing deportation for things that they committed as youth. And that was, at the time, some of the biggest issues for me when I entered this work professionally. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get towards the end of our conversation too. But that hasn't gone away. The kinds of dynamics are still happening now in terms of deportation of people in my community. When I say my community, the larger Southeast Asian refugee community, who's no longer refugee, but they are still impacted by that particular legislation in the 1990s. So it's reemerged earlier this year. So the tensions are different in a way, but the conversations, the practices, the ways in which we see immigrants continue to, be very similar to at that time.
Yeah, and I'll just jump off of that, and I see some really similar challenges to what Dr. Vang's describing. So when I started out, it would have been during the George W. Bush administration, and we saw some really just limited legal options for immigrants who wanted to become, permanent residents or get legal status of some type, and didn't have a way to do that. We also saw, instead of actual, efforts to sort of fix that problem, what we saw was legislation pushed, actually led by Wisconsin Representative Sensenbrenner at that time, to criminalize undocumented immigrants. And there was a lot of organizing and pushback around that, and luckily it didn't become law. But you can get from that, you can gauge some of the climate, right? The scapegoating and the punitive approach to immigration that was going on. And similar to the welfare reform, right around that time in 1996, actually, there was a law we call IRA for short, that was basically just created new penalties for immigrants. And there are things that you didn't even know as an immigrant that was going to count against you. So it was just for your unlawful presence. It basically penalized you just being here without status, and made it, even if you had a legal way, then you marry a US citizen, for example, you have children together who are born here, you may not be able to get legal status because of these bars that were implemented in 1996 law that started in 1997. So you have basically a hostile legal system that has very limited options, a lot of punishment for very, what we would consider, pretty harmless things, like someone coming here for a better life, working, maybe going back to their country once to visit a sick family member and coming back here again to reunite with their family, and then finding out I no longer have a way to get my green card through my US citizen spouse. Things like that were not the case before 1996. Another big problem I saw back then, and really hasn't changed a lot for immigrants, is lack of resources. So that's always a challenge for the immigrant community, to be able to hire an attorney, because your chances of success getting through navigating the system go up so much more when you have an attorney helping. So, obviously there are some great nonprofits that have been doing amazing legal work over the years, but they can't help everyone. And so that is something that I've recognized as a challenge from the beginning, and have tried through my practice to do things like payment plans and, pro bono work when I can, to help as many people as possible. But I guess those are the biggest things that jump out at me from when I started in the earlier years.
Thank you both. I want to talk next just a little bit about how the climate has changed during the general 4 years of the last administration. We know that during the last administration, the outgoing president made immigration and refugees and immigrants a real focus of sort of what I would call white nativist insecurity, in order to advance his own, to advance a political view. It's not the first time this has happened in America, but it's been very front and center recently, I would say. So can you each describe a little bit about how those issues that you see and that you've been thinking about have changed during the last 4 years? And in a minute, we'll come on to the particular challenges of 2020. But sort of generally speaking, from that campaign, which raised immigration again to a very public and flashpoint sort of issue in America, could you talk a little bit about sort of how people's lives have been affected by the people that you work with, how their lives have been affected by the changing climate in the last 4 years? I think we'll keep going in the same pattern. Chia, if you want to go first.
Or Cain, if you want to go first.
Okay. Yeah.
Either way is fine.
And feel free, obviously, both.
To say, you go first.
All right. Cain, you go first.
Sure. Okay. Well, oh gosh, working as an attorney, the change has been dramatic. I'll just give you an idea. I started out, like I said, working under the George W. Bush administration. I've been doing this all through the Obama years, where we saw some real tension between increased enforcement, which I think the Obama administration did in order to try to sort of placate the other side and hopefully get some immigration reform negotiated, which never happened. So there was a big jump in deportations. But then they had DACA and things like that, where there was some more flexibility and some very beneficial program given to young immigrants on the other side. So there was some real, very kind of drastic differences in that policy. Some really good things going on with some really negatives as well. But there was still, I would say, overall a climate of we want to try to give people access to the benefits that they're entitled to under law. The thing that I've seen change so dramatically legally under the Trump administration is an all-out assault on legal immigration. I mean, the assault on undocumented immigrants is still there too. The enforcement climate has been really harsh. And you see that at the border. The border has gotten so much more dangerous than it ever was before. Most of my clients I talk to are scared to even try to go back if they have a family member who is dying. They don't want to go visit if they're worried they can't get back here. So you've seen an increase in enforcement and that type of thing. But the assault on legal immigration has been like nothing we've seen before. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The big one I would point to right now is the regulation on public charge. Now, public charge is just a concept that says, well, any family-based immigration case. So when a U.S. citizen wants to, say, apply for their spouse or another family member to get their green card, they have to also financially sponsor them. They have to show that they'll provide enough support, have a minimum income to support that immigrant family member so that the family member won't become dependent on government benefits. This arose out of sort of the law and the laws that Dr. Vang was talking about before. So what the Trump administration has done is made that rule so much more harsh than it ever was before. It's requiring people to give their credit scores and, it's show that they have language skills. I mean, there's just all these additional requirements that have been added to it that were never that way before. And I'll give you a more concrete example of how this affects people. So I've been doing these types of cases for years. I have a family who has to go through the consulate in Juarez, Mexico to get the spouse's green card. In this case, it was the wife. So we had the husband didn't make enough money to qualify, so we used a co-sponsor, which is a very common practice. It was a friend of the family they've known for many, many years, had plenty of income. She went to her interview, and the officer simply rejected the co-sponsor, saying, well, no, this isn't a family member. How do we know they're going to really be willing to support you if needed? And which really is not even what the law says. But to give you an idea of how difficult this is, the law is working against you, and then you have officials that are sometimes not always applying the law correctly as well. And you're in a consulate abroad, you don't have access to the court system here to challenge their decisions. So I have someone who basically is now stuck in Mexico. Her husband is here with the children. He's working full time. He can't take care of the children. So the children go with the mom. And now you've got this family basically torn apart because of a ridiculous policy that's trying to keep people of low incomes, immigrants with lower incomes, out of the country. That's basically what this is designed to do. And so now they're separated for a long time. We have to refile things, and eventually she should be able to get back here. But the amount of damage that does in that time, where the children are not in school where they've been in the U.S., now they're in Mexican schools, the father has to struggle to send money home and support the family in 2 different countries at one time. It's just a horrendous policy that we have, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. You see the limitations on refugees. The number of refugees has been dramatically limited, and the process to get asylum for people who are seeking asylum but don't enter as refugees, so they may get here some other way. There have been a series of decisions by the attorney generals, and I'll say that plural because there have been so many under the Trump administration, that have eroded the long-standing case law that was favorable to asylum and made it more and more narrow and limited, saying that the social groups who qualify are more narrowly defined than ever before. Basically, ruling out entire groups of people who have been found to be eligible for asylum, like victims of domestic violence or of gang violence in, for example, in Central America. So there is just an all-out attack on every level, from the Department of Justice, which controls the immigration courts, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, which is within Homeland Security. We're seeing a system of what was a customer service-oriented agency in USCIS becoming more of an enforcement agency, which was never its mission. It's supposed to be there to adjudicate benefits for immigrants. So we're just seeing at all levels, in all areas of the government that has some role in the immigration process, what many immigration attorneys have been calling the invisible wall, because the president has talked so much about the wall he's wanted to build, and part of it has been built. But there is really essentially an invisible wall blocking people who qualify under the law. They should have access to these benefits, and they're being denied, or if not denied, they're being dragged out for so long. It takes them so much longer to get them. They have to expend so many more resources to get them. So it's a really serious and dramatic change.
Yeah, I just want to really, emphasize and agree with what Cain has said about the increased scrutiny, right, of immigrants. I am frequently asked by different attorneys to provide expert affidavit for people seeking asylum in the regions in which I teach and research, and it has become very, very challenging, and just a much more difficult process for people who are already, struggling so much, right, to exist. So I see, I mean, so many of the clients have, my heart breaks for them thinking about what they went through to get here, and then the number of obstacles that they have to go through, and it's not even a guarantee. And when they can find out someone to help them pro bono, it's fine, but then for others, it's impossible. But I just want to just offer a couple thoughts about your question. Is that for me, when I think about refugees in particular that I work with, during the Cold War, many refugees fleeing communist countries were more easily admitted to the United States, right? We all remember that people were voting with their feet, communism so bad, and so when they come, it was a little bit easier for people to, to enter some people, not all, to enter the country. But since, I think 1996 in particular, but anti-immigration, as Nathan said, is not a Trump, administration invention. In fact, it's an integrated, I think, aspect of American history, right? It just depends on which regions of the world, which groups of people, but we've always had anti-immigrant legislations. What's interesting for me when I think about refugees and the ways in which America symbolizes for the rest of the world for so many years is that we are a place of refuge, right? That people come here, and this is a land where if you work hard, you have opportunities, and you can, support yourself, and you can build a better life. But I think more and more it has become, again, like the last 4 years, so difficult, so overt to see who is a deserving refugee and who's not, right? That question of who deserves, who's sacrifice, whose situation is more deserving, has become so much more questionable, right? And so there's so many people who are struggling, who were eligible to come to the United States, who would just outright refuse to allow to come to the US. So I think the last 4 years, to me, especially for refugees, the dwindling number, which we'll talk a bit more about, has been the biggest change for me to see the numbers. Historically, well, at least since we started to implement annual ceilings for refugee resettlement in beginning in early 1980s, the number has never been this low. I mean, never, even during, the different wars that we were involved in the Middle East, it has never gotten to this low. Though that's the most, I think, overt change in terms of what I see impacting the people that I work with and study.
Thank you. It's really interesting. As we turn our attention to this year, which has brought with it, not only a rancorous presidential election, but a global pandemic. I'd like to talk a little bit about those two issues and how things have changed in 2020. But I'd also like to think a little bit about something that I've noticed that both of you said, which is the language that we use around immigration. We talk about deserving immigrants, or legal versus illegal immigrants. And I'm wondering, I mean, we've sort of seen the almost at a political level, a sort of weaponization of that kind of language, where we use these metaphors of disease or invasion to talk about our relationship, the body politics relationship to these external influences that are coming in. And I'm wondering, during a year when there's been so much talk about immigration, has that language, that political language, trickled down into the daily experience of the people that you study or that you work with? I mean, are they seeing increased just sort of general expressions of anti-immigrant sentiment and discrimination based on immigration status?
I mean, I can start with this one. Yeah. The pandemic and, all the challenges in our society in terms of racial justice, I think what has really been interesting is that the level, especially the level of anti-Asian sentiment, it has always been there, right? Like Asians were categorically the first group to be restricted from coming to the United States for so long. But the level of anti-Asian due to the pandemic has really made life very difficult for a lot of Asian Americans in this country, regardless of how long we've been here. Some people are fifth generation Chinese American, right? But we'll all kind of regard it the same. And that kind of treatment of who is American, right? Who is American? Some groups are easily integrated into the social fabric of American society, and then other groups are perpetually described as foreign, no matter how long they've been here. But something like the pandemic and all the anti-Asian, anti-Chinese rhetoric, language that has been used by people in power has trickled down to everyday life. Even I've had a few experiences myself, not tragic, but many others have had very, very difficult, experiences, especially here in the Midwest or in Wisconsin and Minnesota, where most Asian Americans here they happen to be Hmong, right? And so we're just, again, that anti-immigrant, anti-Asian, those sentiments are, coming back overtly. And it used to be anti-Chinese, right? But now it's, when you walk down the street, you don't know who's Chinese and who's not. If you just happen to be of Asian descent and physically, look Asian, it has been not just the pandemic, right? But really a difficult environment for many of us. And I have two sons, and even in the past, I have always taught my two Asian, young sons to how to interact with law enforcement if they, come into contact with them. But I'm even more cautious now, reminding them every day how to respond if somebody says something to them regarding the virus or anything like that. Just because they are Asian. That has changed even like my own personal life. And I hear that from a lot of friends and colleagues in the state and in other parts of the country as well.
Before we go to you, Cain, can I just follow up on that? If you don't mind sharing, Chia, how do you instruct them or advise them to respond to that kind of overt?
Yeah, so my sons are two strong young men. One's a football player, nose tackle for Nicolet High School. And so they're really physically strong young men. But I tell them that, if people are physically attacking you, that's something different. You know, you do to protect yourself. But if it's just verbal, right? Some battles are just not worth fighting for. And so I teach my two sons that, you know, if people are trying to blaming you for something that you know you have nothing to do with, right? Don't give them the time of the day. I say that to my children because that's how I practice it too. And can I tell you a really short experience? Okay. So this happened to me. I rented a minivan several months ago, and I was returning it to the airport, and I was Saturday morning. I'm in my sweatpants and just my hat with really funky hair. I enter a gas station because I have to fill up the gas before I return the car. I entered the gas station. I won't tell you which one. And there were two white gentlemen customers, and then a white gentleman, the cashier. When I walked into the gas station, I was the only one wearing a mask. They weren't. And one of the white gentlemen, he said it loud enough. He made sure that I heard, right? And you know what he said? He said, "Hey, dude, man, what do you think about if we all get that corona shit?" Looking straight at me, making sure that I heard. And you know what I did? I just said, you know what? You do not deserve 1 second of my time, because if I engage, that's what you want me to do. So I did what I needed to do, and then I left. So I try to tell my children to make those kinds of decisions, because people want you to engage in those kinds of engagement. They don't do any good, because that's exactly what individuals like that want you to do. But if you don't give them the pleasure of engaging with them and fighting with them verbally, that's not a teaching moment for me. So as a teacher, I choose my battles. So that's what I tell my children.
That's a tragic story. I'm sorry that anyone has to experience that. Cain, can you talk a little bit about your clients and work that you do, and have things come to a head noticeably in 2020? I mean, there's thousands of people screaming at a rally, build the wall. Does it affect how people think about themselves?
Oh, I think so, certainly. I mean, you have those types of things, the comments about, people from Mexico being rapists, and those things that come from our commander-in-chief, is supposed to be our example. And then you have policies like the Muslim banning people from predominantly Muslim countries, which fits right into that same vein of the Chinese Exclusion Act and everything else, trying to keep certain groups of people out, which at its core, I think is probably very, very closely linked to the racism that we have a very long and terrible history of in this country. But I can speak a little bit to I don't have very many clients from those Muslim countries. I tend to have more clients who are Latino, and I think certainly it affects them. There's probably a psychological effect. I do kind of see that come out little bits here and there. And I have some clients who are actually in therapy and things like that. And I think those types of the climate can contribute to some mental health issues. But I think there's just an overarching feeling that, of not being welcome. It comes out in our conversations, and, I think it impacts just people's psyche, and, they're feeling that they're always sort of on edge. Am I going to be targeted next? Is someone going to, try to hurt me because I'm speaking Spanish in the grocery store? And, we've seen things like that happen. We've seen videos of it. So there are just all these examples of this. Another one that comes up a lot in my clients is, especially because so many of my clients are living in rural Wisconsin because they work on farms, and in particular on the dairy farms. Some people may not know this, but our dairy industry is so dependent on immigrant labor. Undocumented Mexican immigrants are a huge percentage of our labor force on dairy farms. So they're living in those communities, and they have to drive to work. We don't have public transit in, those small, tiny towns. So we see racial profiling by the police all the time. I mean, it's a constant thing. I'll have a client come, and I'll be shocked if they don't have several tickets for driving without a valid license or operating while revoked. And after a couple of those, it now becomes criminal. And so basically, because you're just working and trying to support your family, you're now becoming criminalized just by your presence and who you are and the color of your skin. So we see a lot of that. And that is also sometimes how people get swept up into deportation proceedings, because they then have contact with the criminal justice system. If they're booked into jail, there may be some checks and communication with ICE. And then they may be placed into deportation proceedings. So, yeah, I think there's no doubt that there's a huge impact. I only see it in little pieces here and there when it comes out, because, I'm meeting with my clients, talking about their cases. I'm sure when they are with their families and friends discussing it, this has to be front and center to their, their thought process and their feeling about whether to stay here too. And I'll tell you, I've had clients who have decided or talk to me about whether it's even worth continuing their process, or if they should just move back to their home country, knowing that the economic opportunities are going to be far less. They're probably going somewhere that's very dangerous. These days, Mexico, Central America, where a lot of my clients are from, there's a lot of crime, cartels, the gangs. And they're really seriously considering, well, maybe that might be better than being here and being not accepted and not wanted and feeling like anxious and on edge all the time. So I think it's having a profound impact on people. And, I'm very much hoping that we can go through the hard work and time it's going to take to change that.
Are there, given the climate at the current moment for around immigration and refugees, are there places that your clients would prefer to go than the United States if they could? Would they prefer to go to Canada or places in Western Europe? If that were possible, or is this still a place that draws people because of the ideas of economic opportunity and potentially safety and freedom, at least for some of us?
Well, I tell you that I have absolutely had people ask me about Canada, and unfortunately, I don't practice in Canada. Immigration law in Canada is its own thing; it's totally separate. But certainly, people have been looking at those options, and I'm sure some of them have decided to go and apply in other countries rather than be here. I do still think that there is a strong desire by most immigrants who have either been living here already or have family here to be here. And largely it's because of their roots they've already set here, and they feel like they've worked so hard and they're parts of the community. Yes, they're feeling sort of under attack, but at the same time, many of them, I'd say the majority, feel like this has become their home, and they're not so willing to just give it up. Some have talked about it, and I think it's a constant tension in their thought process. But this is really home for most immigrants, and they don't want to leave. There is great economic opportunity still compared with many other places. And I think that people decide to put down roots. They really are usually pretty committed to seeing that through. And a lot of times it's not realistic either. Who's wants to break the family apart? You have kids born here. You're not likely to want to take them and uproot them to a whole nother country. So if the kids are really comfortable here, that's what I see over and over. The parents say, well, I'm gonna stay because it's what's best for my children.
Excellent. We're going to talk a little bit about what the future may bring. Before we do, I just want to note to anybody who is watching this over the Facebook page live stream, if you have any questions for either of our panelists, just type them right into on the Facebook page, and we will make sure that we leave a little bit of time to answer any questions at the end if there are any. So Chia, recently there was some news reports that President-elect Biden spoke about a commitment to increasing the number of refugees allowed to enter the United States. We're now, as you mentioned, at an all-time low, about 15,000 this year, despite nearly 2 million people needing places to permanently resettle. How will that commitment be received, do you think, in the communities that you study and work with?
I think it's completely welcomed, not just by the former refugees themselves, but I want to just back up 1 second and say that despite all of the tensions that we've talked about in terms of obstacles and barriers for refugees and immigrants, I would have to say that there are so many Americans, right, who have actually opened their homes and churches and communities to bring refugees in particular to this country. So yes, there are those overt, in policies, in individual behaviors and group behaviors that target immigrants and refugees, but there's equally many, same number or maybe more Americans who go above and beyond to welcome refugees, like, my family and millions of others. So I wanted to say that too, because I think it's important to think about the question you just asked, that, increasing the number to where it was before or even more, the 1.7 million you mentioned is just, the people who are eligible, right? There are millions more who are not legally categorized as refugees, but they're either internally displaced or in spaces that they're not legally called refugees, eligible for resettlement, but they're displaced and they've been living in that condition for years and years. So to me, increasing the number is still just so little, right? Maybe like 0.67% of the population that are displaced around the world that could actually resettle. So I think increasing the number is going to be welcome. There are already people ready to come who were processed to come and who were told they couldn't come anymore. I think that's going to be welcome. And I keep thinking about like my own family's experience, where if we, sitting in the refugee camp, we were there just long enough to want to remember that we were there. I hope that makes sense. Many others spent decades in refugee camps. We were only there for 6 months. So I remember fondly as a kid, right? But for the adults, it wasn't that kind of fond memory, right? You're running around as kids. You don't worry. Your parents are worried to death, but you don't because you're a child. So I think it's going to be welcome. And I, in particular, think that, that's what America has symbolized for a lot of people, is this opportunity and for people to come here. And I probably wouldn't go live anywhere else, just so everybody knows, because I have traveled all over the world to do research, to work with refugee communities who, if my parents had made a decision to go to a different place, my life would be very different. So every day, every time I get off the plane, come home to Wisconsin or Minnesota, wherever I am, that's home to me. And I can't see myself living anywhere else. And the opportunities that I have here, I have friends in Paris and in other places, and they all still want to come to the United States for the reasons that many people come to the United States. So I think it's going to be completely welcome. I hope that he follows through and give more opportunity for people to come to this country.
Thank you. Cain, does the incoming administration, have they made any similar statements or commitments as far as immigration more generally speaking? So not just refugees, but immigration more generally.
Yeah, they have. One thing, well, they've generally said they're going to work on reversing many of the executive orders and other sort of regulatory and administrative decisions that have been made that have restricted legal immigration. They haven't been super specific yet, which I think is understandable, but I think there's a general sentiment that they're going to be reversing a lot of the policies that we would see as negative, as restricting immigration and making legal immigration more difficult. Another thing that's been mentioned is restoring DACA, which the Supreme Court already tried to do. The administration really hasn't even listened to the Supreme Court. So restoring DACA and potentially expanding DACA, which I think is a good first step. But I think the real challenge here is going to be, it's really the same challenge we've had for decades. And Chia knows this as well as anyone, that the laws themselves have not changed. All the changes we've described over the different administrations have been policy changes for the most part, and administrative enforcement decisions. The laws haven't really changed, except those couple of enforcement, laws that were passed in the 90s to make things more restrictive. We really haven't changed like how many family-based immigrants are allowed to immigrate each year since like the 1950s. And we know that the demographics in our country have changed a lot. The needs of our economy have changed. Just the country has changed, but our laws are really outdated. And I think that, you look at something like DACA, which has helped a lot of people, but it's really just a Band-Aid temporarily for a problem that has been festering for so long. And there is legislation out there. The challenge will be to get Congress to pass it, because that's the only way you can really fix long-term some of these really big systemic problems in immigration, is to pass some laws. A comprehensive immigration reform would be amazing. The DREAM Act would be a good way to solve the DACA issue long-term, but that's only one group of people who are here without status, who are parts of our communities that, are deserving of being here and don't have any options. So I think that the administration has made some good moves. They appointed an immigrant, someone who was an immigrant, as the head of Homeland Security, Mr. Mayorkas. And so that's really, I think, one symbolic move, and that's positive. So we'll see, what the follow through is like. But again, I think there's only so much that can be done. It can be very important changes through executive action, but the long-term solutions are going to be whether the administration can work with Congress in a bipartisan way to get some real legislation done finally after all these years.
We're down to the last 8 or 9 minutes here, and a couple of questions have come in, which I'm just going to read, and you can both respond to, I think, as you would like. The first says, would you both share your thoughts on the prospect of increased or decreased deportations in the communities you work with during the next administration?
I mean, I'll start, but and thank you, Ikra, for asking that question. The very scary thing that happened for a lot of Hmong and Lao, community members back in earlier part of the year was the idea of a deportation agreement with the Lao People's Republic to accept, individuals to be deported for so long because of our relations with Laos. Many individuals who could have been deported weren't. They served their time, they have families now, they're going on with life, but because of crimes that they committed, especially when they were underage, and then they can no longer be eligible to become citizens, I think that's a very, very, I wrote a piece in the Shepherd Express about this, but I think it's, these are individuals who serve their time and they are no threat to society. Many are, productive citizens, well, not citizens, productive members of our communities, their parents, family members. But that looming deportation above their head of about 3,500 to 4,000 individuals, it doesn't make any sense to me personally, because I think that historically, they haven't been a threat to society, and they're productive, they're not committing more crimes, they are, they've done their time, and then to say, oh, finally you will be deported, to me doesn't make any policy sense. It doesn't make any sense for families. Many of these people were not even born in Laos. They're born in the refugee camp, or they were born in Laos, but they may be so young they have no connections there. So it doesn't make sense. We've done that, deporting young people back to Vietnam or Cambodia or other countries who actually have no, some of them don't even speak the native language anymore. And so we know that experience has not worked well for many of these individuals. So to me, it doesn't make sense. I think that we should, encourage, the current administration the new administration, let's just not even go there, especially for this small population. It makes no sense. It doesn't do anybody any good.
And I can add to that a little more generally. I think the signals we've been seeing from the Biden administration, I would think, tell us that they're likely to focus less on deportation and maybe pull back a little bit from such harsh enforcement. That's of course yet to be seen. There have been differences. There are a lot of, it looks like, former Obama administration appointees that are going to take roles in the Biden administration. So if we can get any clues from that, what we saw under Obama, like I mentioned before, was yes, there were more deportations, but there was also some increased flexibility. So what we saw a lot of times is immigrants who were in deportation proceedings and didn't have a legal option to stay here, maybe get a green card, were allowed to, under a concept called prosecutorial discretion, to temporarily close their deportation cases and just stay here if they kind of had clean records and just sort of positive attributes and ties to the country. I would think we might be returning to something along those lines where there's just some more flexibility in the discretionary decisions that we have when we're enforcing the immigration laws. It's really hard to say, but I guess that's my hope, is that they're going to allow the tools that officers and judges had previously to make, rational decisions. Does deportation make sense in this situation? Again, we have the laws on the books, but we have laws that don't match our reality on the ground. We've got, around 10 million or more undocumented immigrants. We can't physically deport them all. So again, every administration has to make its priorities about who will be deported and who won't be. And so my hope is that they're going to be very reasonable and flexible on this, and maybe just focus on people who they really do consider to be dangerous. Currently, like Chia was mentioning, there are many people who have made mistakes way in their past and have reformed and are, doing very well now and are no danger at all. Those folks should have an option to stay here. It doesn't make sense whether they're, Hmong, Laotian, or from anywhere else in the world. We shouldn't be deporting people when they have a long history here, they have family ties here, and their mistakes are well in their past. So I'm staying hopeful, but cautiously optimistic, I'd say.
Excellent. We are running to the end of our time, and I want to stay cognizant of that. There's a couple of more questions. We will get answers to those, I think, and put them right on our Facebook page, on the Milwaukee Equal Rights Commission's Facebook page. I don't want anybody's questions to go unanswered. One of them has to do with the refugee camps at the southern border, and one has to do with some technical questions around immigration and health issues. I want to thank both of you so much for the time you've put in, for the work that you do in our community. Is there any last comments that you'd like to make? What gives you hope as we enter 2021?
I'll go then, since I feel like I'm the elder here, Cain. I am an optimist. I think the pandemic, as well as the social unrest around the country and around the world for racial justice, has really heightened the importance of our time and the difficulties of our time. But I'm hopeful, largely because I know that everything that's happening now has happened before. It's how we respond to them. And I think that we are having conversations, we are taking actions to make sure that, we have resources for those who need it. So that's what gives me hope. And I think that as an educator too, it's young people that, I know we all say this, but it's really young people and their motivation, their energy that fuels my optimism for the future.
Oh, sorry, just unmuting. Yeah, I feel pretty similar. I've always been an optimist. These last 4 years have been so challenging to hold on to that optimism. But I guess it's sort of the pushback. We have all these things going on. The racism that has always been there surfacing even more than ever before. But then you see the reaction to that, from many young people, but just people of conscience, I say, stepping up to the plate and saying, this is not right. This is not the type of country we want to be. We want to be a welcoming country. So I think there is the growing sentiment and willingness to participate. Look at the amount of voter participation. We had the biggest turnout ever in a presidential election. That gives me hope that people are willing to be engaged in the processes we have to make a change.
Super. Thank you both so much. I'm going to conclude by reiterating that this discussion is sort of a preview of what you can expect from Milwaukee's celebration of International Human Rights Day, which is coming up on Saturday, December 12th. So a week from this coming Saturday, from 10:30 to noon. And normally this is a big in-person celebration. It's really fun, and there's music and food and storytelling and inspiring stories from people active in civil and in human rights issues across the city. This year, the discussion will be virtual. It'll be online. You can find out information on the Equal Rights Commission's webpage, milwaukee.gov/ERC, or on the Equal Rights Commission's Facebook page. We've got some national speakers this time. Sort of one of the benefits of having to go virtual is that we can bring people in from further afield, and there's going to be some very good and inspiring discussion around those issues. It's sponsored by the City of Milwaukee Equal Rights Commission, the Milwaukee County Human Rights Commission, and the United Nations Association. With that, I want to make one final pitch for the ERC, which is we're a volunteer commission at the city, and we have numerous opportunities for people to get involved around issues of equity and human rights in Milwaukee. In particular, we are always looking for people to join our standing committees. We have a communications committee, a outreach and events committee, and a compliance and enforcement committee. And we want to have residents and people from anywhere. You don't have to be a Milwaukee resident to join those committees. If you have any interest in participating, I encourage you to go to our webpage, milwaukee.gov/ERC, and leave an email there so that we can get back to you. I chair the communications committee. Our issues for the next year, this coming year, our major issues are going to be around building a robust social media presence for the ERC, but then more importantly, developing much stronger and more consistent channels for communications with the people of Milwaukee to find out what issues in equity and civil rights are of interest to you so that we can bring them to the attention of the city and start to work on them. So please, I encourage anyone with any kind of interest to drop us a line, and we would love to have you. With that, thank you to everyone who made this possible. Patricia Ruiz-Cantu, who has been producing this all behind the scenes, and most of all to our two panelists. Thank you so much, and I wish you a happy end to this year and start to the next one. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.